the most expensive Gibson USA SG. Welcome back, Troglodytes, to your daily dose of guitar information, the Trogly's Guitar Show. So late one night, I get an email from somebody claiming that he has like 20 unique early 2000s Gibson prototypes, and he's been thinking about selling a couple of them. So after inquiring a little bit further, finding out what he has, needless to say, he's got some pretty interesting pieces. But this one, I needed to document. Because A, it's beautiful, and B, it's kind of an obscure piece of Gibson SG history that not a lot of people know about, that was first introduced in the year 2007. Wow. Would you look at that? It's a very dark cherry finish. It's got flame up to wazoo. It's got wood grain on top of that. New old stock with the plastic still on the pickguard. Let's learn a little bit about this. This is known as the Gibson SG Select. Most of them did not look like this at all, so let's switch over to some photos of one that you might have seen before. There we go, this is an SG Select. They were introduced in 2007 and only lasted until early 2008, but during their very short production period, they were the most expensive Gibson USA produced SG. If you're confused by that, there's Gibson USA, which is their production level stuff, then there's Gibson Custom Shop. It's kind of similar to like a Les Paul Supreme, the most expensive USA produced Les Paul at its time. And in fact, there was also an SG Supreme, and that's what the Select trumped as the most expensive. They were offered in Heritage Cherry, a trans black and natural finish. And they had 2-piece flame maple bodies with 3-piece flame maple necks. And these were stylized after Gibson SG standard bodies, so they didn't have the reissue style carvings to the horns. But you'll notice there's no pickguard. So now let's come back to this one. This has a pickguard, and it was that way stock from the factory. And I don't know it for sure, but typically the SG standard body is that batwing style within modern day Gibson production, whereas your more 61 style will have your exaggerated carves. So I'm thinking this might also have a different carve system before they put these things into production as the other body style. We still have our super flamey top, but that's not just the top, it's actually the entire body's wood, so you get the flame figuring back here as well. And yes, this prototype also has an insanely figured 3-piece maple neck, so it follows the production level ones in that aspect. But our serial number on this one dates it to 1 year prior, 242nd day of the year 2006. However, it's not actually marked prototype anywhere, so I have to say prototype in quotations because personally, I only count marked prototypes as a prototype. This is simply a pre-production level guitar that had specs that differed from the final offering. Because the story of many of the guitars in his collection, he used to work at Gibson, and he saved some of them from the chopping block. I don't think that was the story on this one. This was just more so an employee garage type sale. And usually those guitars don't come out of the factory with cases, so that makes sense. However, I have seen one more of these SG Selects with a pickguard like this, and it was on Reverb. It was the natural finish, so there might be one of each of these finishes kicking around out there, but that one was sold as a one-off NAMM show piece. So how expensive was the most expensive? Well, when they were first launched, it was $2,999. However, you could get discounts as low as $2,500 when they were kind of blowing them out new old stock in 2009. And these SG Selects are kind of hard to find nowadays, but thankfully we do have a lot of different versions of a flamey SG. In the modern era, you could check out the SG Modern. It just has a top, but those are readily available, or you could check out the slightly older HP series. We had already talked about the SG Supreme. Again, that's just the top, not the back. But if you really want a Gibson USA that has the flamey back, built the exact same way with the 2-piece body, check out a Supra. It doesn't have the flamey neck, but at least you get the body and a whole bunch of other fun things like a piezo pickup. And then you might check out a Custom Shop SG Elegant. So whatever you want to technically call this thing, let's throw it on the workbench to see if maybe the prototype stamp is hidden somewhere else in here. Because prototype isn't always obvious on the back of the headstock. Sometimes you gotta dig a little bit deeper. Let's go. All right, many of interesting discoveries. I had to call the seller to figure out what was going on with some of this. So our pickups, they cleaned up nicely. We've got chrome covers to them, but when I flipped it over to the back, I was like, 490R, okay, but 2016? The serial number says 2006. And sure enough, the bridge is a 498T with a very similar date. But this is the pickup set that the SG Selects came with. The bridge pickup reads 13.8 k ohms, neck position 7.74, and the middle just for fun 4.95. But with our pickups out of the way, we can see our neck tenon here. That's the reason why you have to have a tenon cover, because of all this. Doesn't look too nice. But then you can see the rest of our maple body and the routes within it. Very rough. But it does help show you it is a complete maple body. There is no like mahogany core to it like a the Les Paul. And it's also not just veneers. Now normally we stay pretty linear, but now we need to look at our electronics. We have a PCB system in here, and Gibson wasn't using PCB boards yet. But then I started thinking, is this a prototype PCB system? They just had this guitar and they were experimenting with this new way to wire their instruments. Maybe they used this as a test subject because it kind of sat around as a prototypical piece. The next interesting thing I noticed is, look right here, the wood has been sanded down ever so slightly, and that's to get this board to actually fit in. You can see the same thing occurred over here too, a little bit of our finish chipped during that process, but thankfully that's all hidden underneath our cover. But again, that was to get the PCB to fit in it, because usually this model is hand wired. So it's at this point when I called the seller and I got some additional info. So I was able to confirm that he was a Gibson employee up till about 2016, and he bought this somewhere around 2014 during an employee yard sale, as they called it. And any guitar that didn't find interest at that sale would just get chopped up and moved on the way. So that's how we got so many of these. But essentially, the way it would go is the research and development team would be working on stuff, and then Henry's office was just down the way. So when they finished something, they would take it to him, and then he would say, yeah, great, go for it. Or, nah, I don't like this. So for this guitar, what we both think probably happened is Henry was probably like, pickguard, yuck. If we're gonna put this premium maple on this thing, we might as well not cover that up. But at the employee sale, the only thing on this guitar was a set of gold humbuckers, the tenon cover, which is still there, and everything else was gone. It did not have the wiring, it did not have the electronics, it didn't have the bridge and tail piece. He did say the holes were already here for the pickguard, but there was no pickguard on it, and it didn't have tuners or anything like that. So it was essentially a husk with some pickups in it. So he just went ahead and completed the guitar that he wanted. So I guess if we want to get really technical, this is a research and development model that never left the factory complete. He also said he used high-performance hardware. So as you can see there, you have your hex key adjustment. Then the bridge might look normal, but it has the titanium saddles. I'm glad he told me that, because I didn't realize that for the high performances. I did notice when I looked on the back that the saddles looked a little bit different than the rest of the chrome, but that's why. It's API branded. And the same thing is true for our tailpiece, advanced plating incorporated. It's your regular full weight style. Your tenon cover is actually made of a gold material. I believe that's how the regular SG Selects are. I would imagine it might be a plated brass type thing. So that just goes there to hide the ugliness. And then if you wanted to take your pickguard off to enjoy this for what it is, you would have these giant holes. So I think you're just better off putting this guard back on. I mean, at least it looks new old stock and looks fancy, but nah, this didn't leave the factory with that. So looking over here on our knobs, I mean, Gibson didn't start using these notch speed knobs till about 2014. That was another thing that made me go, something's probably not quite right there. There's our output jack on the front, 3-way toggle switch. Now, one thing to know about this guitar is the finish is ridiculously thin. You see the wood grain, it's kind of the wavy pattern, that is not finish checking. That is the grain of the wood underneath your flame. But as you run your finger along this, you actually feel the waves of the flame. It is not completely even. That tells you how thin this finish is. But it kind of has a cool effect at the same time. But unfortunately, this thing is just all scratched and beat up. I'm sure it was just banged against other guitars. They were just experimenting. It was never meant to be officially for sale. Thankfully, after I polished it up, the appearance of them drastically reduced, but they're still definitely there. But it's just a really cool double staining effect. I'm not sure if they did that on the other Heritage Cherry ones. So they kind of like paint it black, and then they sand it down, and then they do a red layer over top of that. If I'm understanding that process properly, Gibson does this occasionally, and it gives the guitar such an evil vibe. But now we can move on from our 2-piece maple body to our 3-piece maple neck and rosewood fretboard. Nothing too fancy here, just our trapezoid inlays, binding on the edges, got your regular 22 frets, and the board reacted well to a conditioning treatment. I measure 1.69 inches for our nut width, increasing to 2.09 by the 12th. First fret necked up 0.82, and it chunks up 0.98 by the 12th.
Here's the neck at the 1st fret and the 12th fret. I mean, it's not over the top, but it definitely has a nice rounded C shape and just gets nice and chunky towards the upper registers. Next up, we've got the headstock. At first, I thought this is bubbling lacquer, because many times that's what this discoloration is. The finish has lifted up a bit. However, upon closer inspection, it looks like the veneer that they put over this headstock didn't fully get stained the black color. So initially, I was thinking maybe that's why this one was never completed for public sale. Or maybe that's just what R&D uses, the seconds that they couldn't fully use on the other production models. So we still got our mother of pearl crown, as well as our Gibson logo, and he threw a blank truss rod cover on it. Returning to our backside here, we can just take a look at the awesome figuring. Again, you can see through to the wood grain underneath when you get it in the light just right. The thin finish truly is interesting. We had saw that on the Angus Young signature SG prototype. Some guys believe that a really thin finish allows the guitar to vibrate more. You're not choking out the sustain. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's some truth to that. Now, thankfully, the back isn't quite as chewed up as the front. You do have some dimple impressions and some light worming marks. Nothing too crazy. There's also a small ding right here. That's just an awesome back. Very moving. Just depends on what angle you're viewing it, whether it's dark or if it's light. I will make the argument that these pieces don't really line up together too well when you're looking at it from this angle. And the figuring's definitely there on the side, it's just not as prevalent. So that confirms it is not a veneer. Looks a little bit better on the side that you see while you play. But I wasn't really worried of it ever being a veneer because Gibson typically doesn't toy around with that unless it's Epiphone. We already talked about our electronics, but it's funny, he must have just got these out of the factory, whatever was stock in 2016, because this is the built-in shielding type backplate, which makes sense because he was a Gibson employee. That's why he had access to stuff like this. Our strap button is of the era of all the other parts. It's the large style one. I think they started using these around, what, 2014-ish? Check out the awesome neck. I love it. It's got some impressions, but it's very similar to the Blonde Beauty Les Paul standard that we had just documented not too long ago, except for it's got the cool double staining feature. And there's our serial number that dates it to the 242nd day of 2006. So like 3 or 4 months before this model actually became a real thing. So being in a non-complete state, I was kind of curious, how much did this go for back then? And he vaguely remembers paying about $1,000 for it. Man, those were the days when Gibson didn't care about their research and development and other prototypes when they would sell them off in these employee sales. They don't really do that as much nowadays. They either hold on to it or they sell them in the demo shop now because it doesn't really do them too much good. They mostly prefer the Gibson Golden era to hold an archive. But for being nearly entirely maple, 7 pounds 1 ounce is not too bad for an SG. Let's go ahead and plug it in and hear how this one sounds. Really quite a chimey SG. That was the middle. That was the bridge. Even the neck. Now that we know all about this research and development guitar that eventually became the SG Select, what are my final thoughts on it? It's such an interesting piece. I'm glad I picked it up to document. Initially, this was destined for my personal collection, but honestly, I think I'd rather just have a regular SG Select, since this one doesn't necessarily have a prototype stamp on it. I mean, we know what it is, but I'd rather have one that doesn't have the pickguard personally. And in my opinion, this doesn't display that well. You don't get to see the flames unless you're looking at it like this. You're holding it in your hand. So I think this one should go to a player. So I will put it up. I mean, I'm not gonna let it go cheap. It's cool, right? But if somebody has a regular SG Natural Select or something, and you wanna work a partial trade with that, I might be able to be enticed. But this neck is beefy up towards the 12th fret registers, sometimes almost a little bit too big. So one day I will have to track down a regular Select to see what else might have changed. So if you're interested in being the next owner of this one, you can find it on my website, troglysguitarshow.com, or you can check out my Reverb store. But either way, I hope you guys enjoy your newfound knowledge of the SG Select. Take care.
If you enjoyed tonight's episode, consider subscribing. I post videos like this every day. And you might even enjoy this next one.